webinar series for Census 2020, special outreach to Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander populations all across the United States and in the territories. We are webcasting today from the U.S. Department of the Interior here in Washington, D.C. My name is Tanya Joshua, Deputy Policy Director here in the Office of Insular Affairs. We at the Department of the Interior have partnered very closely with the U.S. Census Bureau and are pleased to host a webinar series on the upcoming decennial census to be conducted on April 1, 2020. The Interior partners in this effort are the Office of Insular Affairs and the Office of Native Hawaiian Relations. The information we will be sharing is for all individuals who will be counted during the census. However, this series does have a specific focus on Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. Before we begin, I'd like to share greetings from the Director of the Office of Insular Affairs, Mr. Nicolau Kula. Also, Doug Dominich, Assistant Secretary, Insular and International Affairs, would like to share the following remarks, and I quote, "I extend my wishes to all for a successful and informative series of webinars and trust that they will be useful. It is vitally important for all communities to be counted wherever you reside in the U.S., including in the U.S. territories. The census will inform our work in the federal government and impact the federal resources available to various communities. Please help spread the word, inform your friends and neighbors, and be counted in the upcoming census." End quote. Now, is my colleague Kimo Kaloi on the line?
I am.
Thank you, Kimo. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Mahalo, Tanya. Appreciate it. My name is Kaini Kaloi. I am the Director for the Office of Native Hawaiian Relations here at the U.S. Department of the Interior. And I just wanted to take a moment to introduce our speaker today, Mr. Michael Hawes. He's the Senior Advisor for Data Access and Privacy at the U.S. Census Bureau. And he's responsible for the outreach and engagement with the Census Bureau's data users on issues relating to the impact of privacy protection methodologies, on the accessibility and usability of census data. Prior to going to the census, Michael served as the Director of Student Privacy at the Department of Education, where he was the department's senior policy official responsible for administration and enforcement of federal laws governing the privacy and confidentiality of education records. Michael's also a member of the Federal Committee on Statistical Methodology and chairs the FCMS's Confidentiality and Data Access Committee. Michael, thank you. I really appreciate you coming here today to share your expertise with us.
Great, thank you, Kimo, and thank you, Tanya. And I appreciate the Department of Interior letting me be here to speak with you about a topic that the Census Bureau cares a lot about today. Unfortunately, my slides don't appear to be showing up, so bear with us for a moment. There we go. All right, so today I'm going to talk with you about privacy and the 2020 decennial census, which we are in full swing now. We did our first enumeration up in Tooksuk Bay in remote Alaska 2 weeks ago. The official census day, April 1st, is coming up in just a short few weeks, actually. So this is an exciting time, and privacy is a really critical part of us conducting the census. Before I start, just a few acknowledgments. I want to thank my colleagues at the Census Bureau who have contributed to what I have in my presentation today. And just to say that any opinions and viewpoints in my presentation are entirely my own and do not necessarily represent the opinions or viewpoints of the U.S. Census Bureau. So the Census Bureau's commitment to privacy and confidentiality is absolutely critical to our ability to produce high-quality statistics about the nation's people and the nation's economy. Protecting the privacy of our respondents and the confidentiality of our respondents' data is both a legal requirement for us and it's a core element of our institutional culture. All information that the Census Bureau collects or receives about our respondents is protected under Title 13 of the United States Code. Census Bureau employees are sworn for life. We take an oath of non-disclosure to safeguard our respondents' information. And the penalties for the unlawful disclosure of any identifiable information can include fines of up to $250,000 or imprisonment for up to 5 years. And I know that's a penalty I don't want to have to face. So we take this legal obligation very seriously. But our commitments to safeguarding the public's data aren't just about complying with the law. It's also essential to ensuring the completeness and the accuracy of our statistics. In an era of declining trust in government and of high-profile data breaches that occur with ever greater frequency, maintaining the quality and accuracy of our statistics would not be possible unless our respondents trust us to properly safeguard the information that they provide. And we can't just consider the privacy threats of today. When we publish our statistics, we have to make sure, under our legal and ethical obligations, that the data are protected today and that they're protected against the privacy threats of tomorrow. The challenge is that we collect all this information in order to fulfill our mission to produce quality statistics about the nation. Information tabulated from the decennial census is used for a wide array of purposes. Most people know that census data is used to apportion seats in the House of Representatives, to draw district boundaries for federal, state, and local elections, and to distribute over $675 billion each and every year. But Census Bureau data are also routinely used for critical decision-making at all levels of government, and they enable policymakers, businesses, analysts, and researchers across the country to measure and assess trends about who we are and where we are going as a society. Supporting these myriad uses requires publishing an enormous amount of statistics and tables, often at very fine levels of granularity, granularity about geographies, granularity about demographic groups, etc. Unfortunately, we know that every time you publish any statistic that's calculated from a confidential data source, you reveal or leak a tiny bit of private information in the process. In 2003, in what later became known as the database reconstruction theorem, Denor and Nassim demonstrated that if you release too many statistics at too high a degree of accuracy, you'll eventually reveal the entire underlying confidential data source. And this challenge is even greater when you consider the privacy threats that we face today. They say that nothing on the internet ever goes away, and the same can be said for data once it's gone out into the wild. Over the past 20 to 30 years, we've seen a massive proliferation of data that could potentially be used to re-identify individuals in our statistical data products. Data about us are collected all the time by the companies we interact with, by data brokers, and through social media, not to mention the trove of personal information available on the dark web as a result of the countless data breaches that have happened over the years. These data could be used in an attempt to pick out specific individuals in the data that we publish. Meanwhile, technology has also improved. Computers can easily perform the complex matching algorithms that would be necessary to leverage external data in order to attempt to re-identify specific individuals. These parallel trends are not abstract concerns. They represent real, concrete threats to protecting confidentiality that need to be addressed. Over the past century, the Census Bureau has been a world leader in the design and implementation of the statistical methods that are used to safeguard privacy in public data releases. As new privacy threats have been identified over the years, the Census Bureau has worked diligently to improve our statistical safeguards to mitigate those threats. Back in the 1930s, we realized that there was a great privacy risk in publishing data about small geographic areas, so we stopped publishing many of those tables. In the 1970s, these concerns had increased and we had to suppress entire tables of our data products. By the 1990s, concern about re-identification of specific individuals led us to adopt a statistical method known as data swapping or record swapping, where we would identify individuals or households who were at risk from a privacy perspective and swap their records with those of a household somewhere else. And now with the 2020 decennial census, in order to counter the growing threats of the 21st century, we're innovating yet again and we're adopting formal privacy or differential privacy, which I'll talk more about in a few minutes. First, why is all this necessary? What is the real risk here? Well, there's a common misperception that when you aggregate data, when you produce tabular results or totals of statistics, that aggregation of the data is sufficient to protect privacy. While this may have once been the case, and may still be true for some limited data releases, it's no longer sufficient to protect privacy in large-scale statistical products. In fact, aggregate tabular data can often be thought of like a giant game of Sudoku, if you play Sudoku or are familiar with it. With Sudoku, if you have enough numbers pre-populated into the grid, and I've got a little example here on the right, if you got enough numbers pre-populated into the grid, then there's one and only one solution to the puzzle. Well, the same goes with aggregate data tables. When you publish enough data tables, when you publish enough statistics, eventually there is one and only one set of individual level person records that could have yielded those aggregate statistics. And while it might have seemed unthinkable a decade ago to be able to convert those aggregate numbers into individual level records, computer algorithms can now perform these types of reconstructions from aggregate tabular data quite easily. So let's look at an example. Imagine that you collected some basic demographics about the 7 people who live on a particular block. You then want to publish some aggregate descriptive statistics about those individuals. How many were female? How many were black? What's the median age of married individuals? And so on. Well, with those basic aggregate statistics, it's a trivial matter to solve for the only set of individual level records that could have yielded those results. And I say trivial, and I really mean it. In fact, it took a 2013 MacBook Pro laptop a grand total of 0.2 seconds to reconstruct these individual level data from the data table on the left. Our would-be privacy attacker now has individual level records for everyone on that block. But can she really re-identify any of them? Can she attach a name or figure out who they are? Well, it turns out that this is also a relatively trivial exercise. While the reconstructed individual level records did not have the specific individual's names, they did have a number of pseudo-identifiers that can be used to link those records to an outside data source that does have names. In this particular example, the attacker can use the age and sex of those individuals to match the reconstructed records to third-party data, say, for example, voter registration lists for that block. Now, it's easy to attach a name to the records, and you've just learned Jane, Joe, and John's race and relationship status. So recognizing the growing threat posed by the proliferation of external data sources that can be used to attempt to re-identify individuals, and the increasingly powerful computer algorithms that can perform these analyses and actually conduct the re-identifications, the Census Bureau recognized that traditional approaches to protecting privacy in our public data releases are becoming increasingly insufficient to protect our respondents' privacy. So to meet our continuing obligation to safeguard respondent information, the Census Bureau has committed to modernizing our approach to privacy protections and has adopted differential privacy for the 2020 census. So what exactly is differential privacy? Well, differential privacy, also known as formal privacy, is a framework for quantifying the precise amount of privacy risk, or that private information leakage I mentioned earlier, for every calculation, every table, every data product that we're going to publish, no matter what third-party data are available out there, and no matter what kinds of computing power, computing algorithms could be leveraged to attempt to re-identify those individuals. Said slightly differently, formal privacy as an approach allows us to precisely measure and mitigate the leakage of private information in our published statistics. It's a mathematically provable privacy guarantee that we can give to our respondents. By quantifying that risk, known in the differential privacy literature as the sensitivity of the calculation or query. Differential privacy allows us to mitigate the risk to an acceptable level by injecting precisely calibrated amounts of statistically neutral noise to our calculations. But what constitutes an acceptable level of privacy? Well, the only way to absolutely eliminate all privacy risk in a data set would be to never publish any usable data at all. And clearly, as the nation's leading provider of quality statistics about the nation, not publishing data just simply isn't an option for us. So Census Bureau policymakers have to find the optimal balance wherein we're providing data that are sufficiently accurate for all those uses that I mentioned earlier, while also being sufficiently noisy, sufficiently adjusted to meet our legal and ethical obligations to safeguard our respondents' privacy and confidentiality. That said, once you identify that ideal point on the spectrum where the data are both accurate enough and sufficiently protected, that point becomes known as your privacy loss budget. And you'll often see this in discussions represented by the Greek letter epsilon. Much like a monetary budget, the lower your privacy loss budget, the less privacy you're willing to give up. An epsilon of 0 would be the world of perfect privacy, but completely useless data. An epsilon of infinity would be the world of perfect data, but no privacy protections at all. So we've adopted differential privacy for the 2020 census because it's the only mathematically provable statistical approach to safeguarding privacy and confidentiality for our respondents. But what does our adoption of differential privacy mean for the 2020 decennial census? What does it mean for the data? Well, for starters, let me be absolutely clear that the Census Bureau's adoption of formal privacy will not alter our constitutional mandate to apportion seats for the House of Representatives using the actual enumeration of state population. Our remaining data products, including the Public Law 94-171 redistricting data, will have privacy protections applied as they have in prior censuses. Only this time, the noise will come from differential privacy rather than from the record swapping mechanism we used in the past. The switch to differential privacy does require us to reevaluate the quantity of the statistics and tables that we will be releasing, as each additional statistic or table that we release uses up a fraction of that privacy loss budget I mentioned earlier. Consequently, the proposed suite of 2020 census data products will be somewhat different than in the past. And if you want to learn more about those differences, there'll be a link at the end of my presentation. You can search 2020 census data products on our website, or I believe one of my colleagues, Rachel Marks, will be giving another webinar on our data products later in this series. If you want to know more about how we protect privacy, how we protect confidentiality, and how we're securing our information technology systems, our IT systems for the decennial census, there's a link here to our data protection webpage, and there's a great little PSA video that's linked there that goes into many of these issues in more detail. The modernization of our disclosure avoidance methods for the 2020 census has not been an easy undertaking. This is cutting-edge technology, and we're really excited to be deploying this on such a scale for the 2020 census. But the growing vulnerabilities of traditional methods have meant that we needed to adopt a 21st century solution to counter these 21st century threats. So it really is necessary, and it's worth the effort that we're putting into it. The design and optimization of our disclosure avoidance methods is still ongoing and will continue over the rest of this year. If you want to learn more about this initiative, the mechanisms involved, the technology involved, et cetera, or if you would like to stay informed about design improvements to our differentially private algorithms, please check out our disclosure avoidance in the 2020 census webpage that I have linked here. And if you're particularly data or computer savvy and you want to get under the hood of the algorithm, so to speak, you can find a link to the Disclosure Avoidance Systems code base on that page too. And we would love to hear from you if you have any suggestions for how we can improve it still further. And with that, I know we have some time left for questions, so I'll turn things back over to Tanya to get the Q&A started.
Thank you very much, Michael. Appreciate that. Does anybody on the line have any questions that they would like to start off with? While we're waiting, Michael, for any questions, I actually have an observation. And so there's always been a concern. It seems the concern is the smaller populations and the privacy. So as you know, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander populations are the smallest of all the ethnic groups or groups that you're looking at in census. So what can you say about that particular population and any data products? How do you balance that when the populations are so small?
So that's an excellent question, and it's one that we struggle with because it's quite often the small populations, the smallest populations that most desperately need quality data because they're often the populations that need to be able to use that data to argue for resources, to argue for assistance, to feed into numerous programs at the federal, state, local, tribal levels. So small groups need quality, accurate data to go about their daily business. But it's at the same time, it's the small populations that are at most risk from a privacy perspective because they're the ones that are most easily picked out in anonymized or aggregated data because they don't share the same characteristics as the other people that we're collecting data on. So doing this balance of how do you produce accurate data for small groups while also sufficiently protecting privacy for those small groups has been a traditional and long-standing challenge for those in the federal government that produce data and that apply statistical safeguards to protect that data. With differential privacy, that challenge is still there, but we are exploring a variety of ways to make sure that we're going to produce detailed, high-quality data about small groups that are sufficiently accurate to meet federal program requirements, to meet funding requirements, to assist with grant applications, etc.
So if looking ahead and talking about the data products going as we come out of the census this year, is it the case that Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community leaders who are interested in particular data sets, do they come and talk to the Census Bureau? Is there a place to manage that?
Yes.
The production of products, basically.
So as I mentioned during my talk, because we're shifting our methods, because we're deploying a different approach to privacy, we are of necessity having to reevaluate which data products we're going to release. So what we produce for the 2020 census will not be the exact same slate of tables that we produced for 2010 or 2000. The final list of those products has not been finalized. We have proposals for what we're planning on releasing, but we are still accepting feedback on those. Actually, through the link that's on the screen right now, on that page, there's a link to what we labeled the 2010 demonstration data products, which are essentially were kind of releases of the 2010 data or some of the 2010 data in the form that we're proposing those data would take for the 2020 census to allow people to kind of go in and see what data products there. And with that, there is a website, an email address that concerned individuals, that local leaders can respond to provide input on what data tables they find most useful for their program. What disaggregations of population characteristics by sex, by race, by detailed race, by age, by household status, are necessary for the various uses to which they put the data. So we are absolutely soliciting feedback from our data users on what they find most important and how they use our data, because knowing how the data are being used will allow us to make sure that in those final data products that we release, that we're releasing the data that people need and that we're releasing it with sufficient accuracy to make sure that it meets their needs.
Thank you very much, Michael. Just as a reminder, what I will be doing is we have a website page, the Office of Insular Affairs does, dedicated to this webinar series, and we will be updating it. This is just the look of it, but there's the info, and we will be updating it with today's presentation, your contact information, if that's okay, Michael.
Absolutely.
And Michael is absolutely correct. On Thursday, March 12, we will have a special webinar presentation on census data products. So that's very useful to know that there is time for feedback and for leaders, community leaders to reach out.
Absolutely, and Rachel Marks, my colleague who will be giving that webinar, is absolutely one of the people that interested parties would want to speak to about how they're using the Census Bureau data, because she is right at the center of many of those decisions about which data products and what form are we going to be releasing.
One thing that I thought was interesting in a conversation I had with you, Michael, was that we talked about economics and the census, at least here in the 50 states. Mm-hmm. So the data that is released from the decennial, there is no economic data.
Correct. So this is a common source of confusion for many people. They think the Census Bureau, all the data that we release is from the decennial census, and that's actually not the case. It is our biggest endeavor, certainly, but the once every 10 years decennial census only collects a few pieces of information about every individual. We collect who the individuals are, their sex, their race, their ethnicity, and their household structure. There's a lot of other data that the Census Bureau publishes from other censuses and surveys that goes into a lot more detail about economic issues, participation in various social programs, employment, all of that. Those are not pieces of information that are collected or released as part of the decennial census. The decennial census, as I said, identity, like who you are, your sex, your race, your ethnicity, and how your household is made up.
And I just wanted to add that the census that will be conducted in the territories will be markedly different from the census in the 50 states. So those of us who are in the 50 states, in the mainland and Hawaii, will have this abbreviated form as opposed to those who are in the territories. And we will have a webinar discussion on that topic on February 20, on Thursday, so 2 weeks from now.
Puerto Rico in that list too.
Okay,
so the 50 states, DC, and Puerto Rico are getting
will be similar.
Will be similar. The island areas will have a different process.
Okay, great. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? No burning questions. Take advantage of Michael while he's here.
And if you're like me and you come up with a question right after the webinar ends, my contact information is there, and I believe Tanya will be putting it on the website. I'm always happy to take questions via email or phone at a later date.
Yes. So thank you very much for joining us. This is really an effort to help reach out to Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities in the United States and in the territories. So thank you for joining us. We will be having our next webinar will be next week on Thursday, February 13. I know the time is not always convenient for people, so we have, as I displayed earlier, that website page that can be used as a resource later. We would invite you to visit it, share that website page, please. Everything links back to census.gov so that you can have contacts, links to all the products that are available, and we thank you very much for joining